Hey everyone, welcome back to the Heal, Nourish, Grow podcast. Today I have Dr. Padilla, who is a gastroenterologist, and she is passionate about all things health and wellness. And we had a great little chat before we started recording today. And I think you are really going to love what she has to say because her kind of paradigm is very in line with what we do here at Heal, Nourish, Grow. So anyway, welcome, Dr. Padilla. I read your bio for everyone, but maybe you could share a little bit about your background, how you got, obviously you're a doctor, so that's one whole thing, but any personal health things that led you into the field that you're participating in now. And welcome again.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here. So I have always been passionate about health and wellness, and it started with nutrition. I was just like an athlete growing up, and then it just stemmed from there. But really, I set an intention over the last few years, mostly because now I'm a mom and have two young girls, and my husband is a former NFL player, and he had been diagnosed with neurocognitive deficits because of concussions. And so these sort of like rude awakenings of kind of the fragility of life. And we started being much more conscious in the way we live our lives. So that meant being really mindful about the foods that we were intaking and how we were doing it and living our day-to-day lives. And so just learning that out of necessity for my personal family and health then has translated that into like my patients. And I do that for my patients that I see because I still practice. And then now that led me to kind of the passion of coaching people. So now I do a lot of health coaching and just making the knowledge that I've gained with that available to them.
That's wonderful. And I think it's something that, a lot of physicians, obviously, the way that our healthcare system is designed these days and working with insurance companies, you don't always have the time when you're working within that paradigm to help people in the way that you could. So I think it's really pretty cool that you're like kind of going into a health coaching thing. Additionally, how does that look for you? I assume that might be outside of the insurance model, but maybe you could share with people a little bit how you work with people and how that has evolved since you first became a practicing physician.
Sure. It is outside of the health insurance realm, and it'd be nice if maybe insurance companies would value preventative care more.
Yes.
And
hopefully
more lifestyle modification. Yeah, I know. The concept of food of medicine is medicine is like very foreign to insurance companies, but it really has evolved into like a beautiful thing, really. And like I said, it kind of stemmed from just like my personal experience. And now I just have found myself just kind of one-on-one, like doing coaching with folks. And it's been any range of people that are just wanting to just get reassurance that nothing big, bad, or scary is going on and that they're doing the right thing. I think what I found is that I end up being almost like the bridge to those people that actually do see a gastroenterologist in their day-to-day lives for whatever medical condition. I end up almost being like their advocate, like their sidekick, so to speak. Their clinic visits are usually really short, like 15, 20 minutes long. And so then when they leave a doctor's office, they usually have all these unanswered questions or uncertainties. And then they go on Google trying to find the answers on Google. And what I have found is that by coaching, I have bridged that gap, that missing piece, which is like answering all those unanswered questions and spending the dedicated time that we can't do in clinic because we aren't allowed to really. And there's so much oversight by bureaucracy and insurance and, the administrators by telling us that we can't see patients for very long. And so unfortunately, like a lot of, I think, people that are in the healthcare space have branched out into health coaching as a way to offer more services and access to patients. Unfortunately, I think you bring up a good point with the insurance thing. Unfortunately, it's just not always covered by insurance, or it isn't, and it's just out of pocket. So the people that are able and willing to pay are the ones that get access to that sort of information. On the flip side, social media is free. And so there is some really good resources online too, that people are out there in the space doing really good work, educating patients on things that they need to know, which has been really awesome. I think there's been a lot of shifts online and on social media too for people in the health industry.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's great that you're taking advantage of that. I think that you said in our pre-chat too, that you're kind of more focused on that now and sharing this information in a way that is accessible to people for free, which I think is absolutely amazing. And it does help whether people want to, sometimes it's like I've often said that, I wish I would have finished and gotten the letters behind my name, because then it does automatically give you more credibility, even though there's still plenty of good sources out there for people that don't have the letters behind their name. But I really appreciate that you've kind of taken this on yourself, because not only do you have the credentials, but you now have, this additional platform to share your wealth of knowledge. So I appreciate that. And I'm glad that you're sharing that more now, on social media. Before we go into more about your sort of practice and everything, so you're a traditional gastroenterologist, and I know one of the things that you really like to educate people on is more about gut health and kind of dispelling some myths. So I will say there's definitely a lot of conflicting information online. We're just starting to really get into the microbiome and starting to understand what that means. But it's still kind of in its infancy, I think. So maybe you could share some color around what you encourage people to do as a gastroenterologist that is based in science and that does have some meaningful background, instead of just sort of these myths floating around out there, like take a probiotic, not an antibiotic. That would actually be bad for your gut health. You want to avoid antibiotics. And I think that's not a myth. But anyway, some color for that for the folks out there listening.
Yeah, gosh, it's so overwhelming, and I totally get it. Even me just going to a grocery store and looking at the health aisle, and just the sense of overwhelm and panic and almost like fear that you're going to pick the wrong drug or wrong supplement. But yeah, there is so much information overwhelm, I think, that people are experiencing. And so I totally get it. But I think the key to keep things really into perspective is that it's so much simpler to achieve really great health than people think. And I think the people that are getting sold a lot of supplements and this one magic pill that's going to change their life and maybe be the cure end all be all for certain things is oftentimes not true. You want to be just very suspicious of that when people tell you that this one thing is going to help. And I think if you can just view things online and with that sort of lens, just recognizing that may not be necessarily true, then you're on the right track. Always question. And I will be honest with you, and I hate to say this, is that there's people, even gastroenterologists, that are spreading sometimes maybe not accurate information. Because if we're really trying to stay in the science, I'll just give you a couple quick examples. One is that gluten is unhealthy. That's maybe one myth that's out there, and maybe misconception. And I think it's misunderstood. I think it's kind of villainized. And you'll see a lot of very well-respected physicians and practitioners are saying that it's, the thing to avoid and the cause of all of your problems. And when in fact, there's not literature really to support that. I will say there are conditions that being gluten-free is very reasonable and very much may help impact, symptoms. And that is if you have celiac disease, so an actual autoimmune condition that can affect your whole body really after you eat gluten, which is a protein that's found in, different food products, think of breads and pastas and pizza. And so that protein is the protein that kind of makes things kind of malleable. So think of the pizza man, throwing the pizza in the air and able to kind of keep the dough together. That gluten protein is what keeps it together. Well, when patients with celiac disease have gluten, it causes all this inflammation throughout their body. So those are really the only patients that should be gluten-free totally. Now, there are other people that have autoimmune conditions where their immune system is kind of revved up that may value from being gluten-free. And even people that have irritable bowel syndrome, which many, many people do have, may have a lot of value in being gluten-free because sometimes that can be a trigger. Now, oftentimes what we're finding is that gluten-free means also avoiding processed foods. So is it the processed foods avoidance that's actually helping you with your symptoms, or is it really the gluten that's causing the symptoms? And that's always a question I think to always kind of explore, and talking to a dietitian is really awesome and a really great place to start. like an actual registered dietitian, not necessarily like a nutritionist or health coach, just because a dietitian can sometimes help differentiate that stuff. And so that's kind of one thing that I think that's out there on media that gets a lot of confusion and a lot of misinformation, and it's really hard to navigate. But there is a role for certain patients to be gluten-free, just not everybody. And it's not the villain, the big bad thing that I think is characterized a lot of the time. Probably the second thing I would say is colon cleanses. As a gastroenterologist, when I hear that you need a colon cleanse for your health is not exactly true, or it's not true. Because your colon or your large intestine is really a naturally cleansing organ, right? Like when you poop, like you're pooping out all the stuff that your body didn't need. And so, the key is really making sure that you actually have regular, good bowel movements. So, when you poop, you're doing it regularly, and in between your bowel movements, you feel great. Now, if you're not feeling so good in between bowel movements, then there's issues that need to be addressed. And whether it's you're actually constipated or, you're not eating enough fiber, Americans are really fiber deficient or fiber starved. And so a lot of times the answer is if you have more fiber in your intake in your diet, and you're doing things to have more regular bowel movements, you'll feel better. But everyone knows, like, when you have a good bowel movement, like, that just feels great. So I get how, like, cleansing that can feel like you need a colon cleanse, but in reality, you don't need it for health. You just have to kind of wonder, well, why are you thinking you need the colon cleanse? Is it because you're actually not having good bowel movements on a regular basis? That kind of thing. It's really a market for people to spend money on something like getting a colon cleanse or colonic. There are reports of people having like issues and complications from those sort of procedures, like doing, there's, perforations or injury to your colon can happen when you're sticking a tube up your bottom with someone that's not exactly trained to do that. And then people do like coffee enemas and these other things that you can do to facilitate like the cleanse, so to speak. So I would say those are like the top two things that really can drive a gastroenterologist crazy when we hear that. But I get it. Like it's, you think that you might need it. You think that colon cleanse is necessary. But it's just not. And the same thing with gluten. Gluten's not the villain that it's really painted out to be for most people.
Yeah, I think for the people it is a problem. It's obviously a huge problem and can be very detrimental, but it's not necessarily. Now, people in my space, because you probably had seen this on the website, we're very focused on like low carb nutrition. And I think what you said is very accurate. It's not so much that it's the gluten itself, but it's like because it generally comes in very highly processed foods. And that can be a big thing. And that's actually where I often tell people to start. It's like, well, even if you never want to go low carb, just eat real food and you'll be like 90% of the way there. So since you brought up the colon cleanse, we're on the subject, we might as well stay on that for a moment.
Sure.
Because I've learned a few things lately about this. And that is, and for people that aren't aware of this, number one, that they're now recommending that the age that you have your first colonoscopy is now 45 rather than 50. And they are starting to, unfortunately, and I actually know someone that's going through this right now, a very young person who has colon cancer. So can you maybe speak a little bit to, number one, what's the importance of doing this procedure at a younger age now? And number two, if you have any ideas or if you've read anything in the literature about why we may be seeing this particular type of cancer at younger ages now.
Yeah, no, I'm so glad you brought that up, because I'm finding people still aren't aware that we made those recent changes from age 50 to 45. And so really everyone needs to get their colonoscopy starting at age 45 at this point. And the reason is because we're seeing an increasing rate of colon cancers in younger patients. And what's unfortunate is when we're actually finding things, sometimes they're more advanced. And so So really colonoscopies are so incredibly important. There's very few things in medicine that we can do where we can actually catch a cancer early if we can do the procedure, right? So the only things that we really have in our arsenals these days is doing like pap smears and mammograms. And like colonoscopies is one of those things where we can do something and potentially catch something early. And sometimes colon cancer can actually begin as something called like a colon polyp, and it can begin as like a little mini tissue growth or a little mini mushroom or tree that grows in the colon. And when we see it, we remove it because some polyps are considered precancerous. And there's really no substitute for colonoscopy, to be honest. There's other options that we can offer people if they are, for some reason can't do a colonoscopy or whatnot, but a colonoscopy is really where it's at. Like that's the only way we can get the most accurate information and really do the best exam, because it's really considered a preventative exam if we can catch you early. Now, the age of 45 is for routine screening, meaning like if you don't have symptoms of like bleeding or, abdominal pain or diarrhea or something that could maybe, raise our alarms. Now, if we're doing a colonoscopy because you're having bleeding, that's a completely kind of different reason to do a colonoscopy. We may do it at age 30 for if you have bleeding in your stool. Like as a gastroenterologist, these days we have very low threshold, meaning like we're very eager to do a colonoscopy on someone that's young, saying that they're having bleeding. We do not just chalk it up to hemorrhoids these days. And again, it's because of this rise in colon cancer, and we don't know exactly why. There are thoughts that it's certainly for multiple reasons, which can include the processed foods that we're eating, which has been found to kind of increase that risk, and exposure to tobacco and other toxins, and just like environmental exposures has been very big, and the processed foods and the red meats and these sort of preservatives that we've been seeing, like nitrates and nitrites and those sort of things that are put in our processed meats. So when I think of processed meats, I'm thinking like deli meats or hot dog meat, and some of the fast food sort of processing that they do, and some of these meat patties that you just don't really know, what does it even look like meat kind of stuff. And so we don't exactly know the reason. It's a very alarming thing that we're finding, and very important. The one thing I want people to remember too is that we always think about, well, my family doesn't have a risk factor, a family history of colon cancer, so I'm not at risk. One thing to keep in mind is that if you have a family history of colon polyps alone, it might even increase your risk of colon cancer. And so it's important to ask your family members, like your parents or your siblings, hey, did you have a colonoscopy? If so, like, well, what did they find? What kind of polyp? How big it was? Like, get that information, just get those records and take it to your doctor and ask them, like, are they at risk? Should they get a colonoscopy and consider it to be early? Because it's not just the colon cancer family history that's important, but even colon polyps. And the polyp part is something that's not as well known and recognized as a risk factor to potentially do a colonoscopy earlier than age 45. So that's important and something to recognize.
No, I'm really glad that you brought that up, because to me, that makes perfect sense just based on my family. There's a lot of cancer in my family, unfortunately, and colon is not one to this point. But I do remember my dad, who had other kinds of cancers. He would always be really funny about like giving us the health update, right? So definitely in relation to his cancer, but also like, hey, I went and got a colonoscopy. And that is one thing for years. He always said, well, I went and got a colonoscopy, had some polyps, they removed them, not cancerous, but would always tell us that. And so between it being time for me to have mine again anyway, between my friend having now colon cancer and my dad's history of polyps, I just went, and I might as well just share this now. I mean, sorry to like throw this in the middle of your interview here, but
okay.
I actually did have a polyp. They removed it. The doctor called me, and not cancer, all benign, but he did say it is the type of polyp that if left had a significant chance of developing into cancer. So, just for whatever it's worth. Also, it is not difficult. I mean, the prep is the worst part. I actually afterwards felt amazing, like woke up really quick, felt good, and went about the rest of my day. So I think people put it off for, I mean, yes, does it take a day out of your life to do it? Yes. But considering what the outcome could possibly be if you ignore symptoms or you don't get it done quickly, I would say it's basically a non-event. Like, and if you wanted a colon cleanse, if you thought you needed one, then you're going to get it before you go to a colonoscopy, right?
Like, people pay for this kind of stuff, right? Like, people pay cash.
Right?
So yeah. And I love that you said that it was really like a non-event, because I've never had someone tell me that their colonoscopy was worse than they expected. Like, they always come out of it saying that it was, oh, this was so much better than I thought it was going to be. Thank you. Like, the prep was worse, really. And I've had that every single time. People always complain about the prep being the worst thing. And, I get it. Like, there's certainly a lot of barriers to getting the colonoscopy, but that's one of the things that our field is trying to educate people on, the fact that it's just accessible. It's there. It's really not that bad. And we can just, if we can just do it, we can hopefully catch something early before it becomes something. And that's what's really important.
Yeah. And potentially, and also just to underscore the importance of, and this has been happening all through the pandemic, right? That people put things off. And I was guilty of that too, because it was time for me to go. And I called and they wanted me to do a COVID test and all this stuff. And I was like, no, thanks. I'll just wait, because, it used to be 50 and I wasn't quite there yet. I'm going to be there in April, but I put it off. And had my friend not had this come up, quite honestly, I might have put it off another year or two. And meanwhile, I had this polyp in there that could turn into cancer. So just to not make this like doom and gloom, but it's an easy thing, and go do it. So let's move on from that. Let's talk a little bit more. We're kind of starting to talk about some of the gut health stuff. So in your view, knowing what you know now, what you're seeing in the literature, what are some practical things, aside from avoiding processed food, which is always a highlight of this podcast, but aside from that, are there supplements? Are there specific foods to be eating? Are there things that you can do to significantly improve your gut health, and then by extension, hopefully be improving, the whole track of that stuff, avoiding polyps, avoiding, any possible future complications? What would your recommendations be, to the extent that you're able? I know obviously you're a doctor and she's not giving medical advice. She's just sharing information.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think the one thing that's going to have the biggest impact on your health is avoiding not just processed foods, but avoiding red meats. Really avoiding red meat and processed meats. Like I said, those are kind of risk factors for colon cancer, but also for heart disease. Because when you really think about what's the number one thing that's, killing Americans, it's heart disease. And so if we want to think about, well, what's going to have the biggest impact on our health, it's that. And so I would say avoiding red meats and processed meats as much as you can. And I get it. Like, some people love their piece of steak, and that I'm not saying like you need to give that up, but it's maybe now being more mindful of, getting high quality meat, right? So instead of going to Outback, maybe go to that fancier restaurant and make it a big event. Like, I'm going to have my piece of steak. And that's really, because I get it. Food brings people joy, and especially, certain sort of foods. And so that's what I would say is avoiding red meats and processed meats. And the second thing is being more mindful about plants intake, like eating more plants, like being more plant-based and whole food plant-based. So we know that kind of more Mediterranean style consumption of food. So like olives and olive oil and nuts and seeds and these whole grains are just really awesome for our overall wellness. I like to mirror the kind of blue zone sort of concepts. I don't know if your audience would be familiar with that. I'm sure you've probably touched on it. And so it's just this really awesome, really observation of these people that have lived really long lives. And when you really think about it, we all just want to live like really long lives, live them well with joy and not many health problems, right? And if we do the things that these people are doing, their concepts are really simple. Like they don't do anything very complicated, but they definitely eat a lot more whole grains and a lot more like veggies and fruits and vegetables. So more plant-based. They do eat meat, interestingly, they eat kind of pork, but they eat very small portion sizes of meat. They eat more fish, but they partake in being out in nature and keeping their bodies moving and have these sort of concepts of engaging with others and love and community. And so if we do these sort of concepts, then we're on the right track. I just think it's just so much more simpler. They even drink wine. So alcohol's still on the table, so you can still drink your wine and have your piece of steak. But it's really just taking a step back and just being more big picture and less like, oh, I have to now just be on the keto diet. And that's not really the case. And it's just a lot simpler. So that would be my take home.
Yeah. And since you mentioned the blue zones, I think one thing that's interesting when people really start diving into this. So first of all, we can't really rely on Ansel Keys very well because he kind of cherry picked his data, right? He only focused on 7 countries and he really, did not do proper scientific method on his analysis of that. But I think one of the things that comes through with the whole Mediterranean lifestyle, and you really touched on it, is the importance of community and movement. And I just wonder when you look at all the blue zones, because their food stuff is not necessarily consistent. Like I think Okinawans are one of them, and they have a very high carb diet, a lot of rice, a lot of fish because they're on the coast. And then you have parts of the Mediterranean, for example, certain islands in Greece where they exist a lot on goat meat, not a lot of agriculture, because not every island is really suited to that. So there's this whole variety of lifestyles and people within these blue zones. The other ones are the Seventh-day Adventists that are all vegetarian. Mm-hmm. And then we have, so there's just like such a variety, but I think the commonality with all the blue zones is really this idea of community and movement. So I don't know, when we've run across some of this stuff, what do you think, if you had to pick one thing out of all of that, what we've learned from the blue zones, is there one thing that stands out to you more than the rest?
Mindset, really. I think you bring up very great points, and it's really all the things, right? It's not just like one thing, it's just all the things together. And it's really more mindset. They engage in things that are more grounding. Have more mindful practices. Maybe they don't label things like I'm practicing mindfulness or I'm meditating, right? But they engage in activities that basically have those sort of foundational practices. And I think to me, that's incredibly important. And I see that even in my practice now, currently, like so many people that have, for example, like irritable bowel syndrome or other medical conditions, even cancers, they have sometimes incredibly better outcomes when they engage in activities that are more about their mindset and wellness and kind of how they approach their life. And a lot of it is really kind of more mindfulness and actually meditation sort of principles, which is really incredible. And I don't think we know all the answers, but we don't know. And something that's very much evolving, but it really is, this whole mind gut connection, it's really real. And we don't know exactly necessarily which one came first, the chicken or the egg, but we recognize the value of what's going on in here, and which then translates to everything else in our body, has a direct impact one way or the other. And it's a highway going back and forth. But mindset to me and how you have coping mechanisms in place to deal with things that happen in your life is incredibly important. And I think that trumps diet and a lot of things. Sometimes it really does.
Yeah, I think that speaks to, I'm sure you've heard some of these stories occasionally when they'll interview somebody, a centenarian that's, over 100 years old. And there's no commonality there either. Like some of them will say, well, I ate 2 eggs every day and drank a glass of wine. And then some will say, I never ate an animal in my life. And some will say, all variety of things. And I think the only thing that I've noticed commonly is that they seem to have this mindset, because some of the interviews you read, you can just tell they're kind of like a very interesting kind of person. And then secondly, just that idea of community and the diet stuff. not to say that diet isn't important, because I obviously think that it is, but it speaks to the fact that I think mindset has to be a big part of what's underlying all of those things that allow people to have not only greater lifespan, but health span, enjoying your life while you're doing it.
Yeah, I follow a lot of the work of Dr. Joe Dispenza too, and I know he's studying that. I don't know really the data that he's getting, but I know that he's absolutely studying the power of your mind and meditation and how that impacts your health. And so I'm going to be very interested in seeing what those results look like. But anecdotally, meaning like from just watching and people in his audience and people that participate in his events and read his books will say, I meditate and I do all these practices, and then, oh my gosh, my symptoms of whatever are gone, or, oh my gosh, I'm now cured. And it just makes you question and wonder, wow, the body is an incredibly powerful system. And I think we are just much more powerful than we think we are. And our minds are certainly more in control, and we are in control of our minds. Like we have the power to make some change and impact. And so I think it's very interesting, and it's awesome. I think it's kind of a cool place to be in science, because it's changing. It's, I know things have changed. I mean, we're not learning the little food pyramid. Oh, sorry, guys. We're not learning the food pyramid thing. Let me turn this. The food pyramid like we learned in school. And so it's just all that knowledge that we learned when we were little kids, like, needs to go out the window. And, I think if there's going to come a place in like kids when they're learning nutrition and how to be really well in their lives, it's going to change. And we're going to probably have mindset somewhere way up there at the top instead of, I don't know, eat more dairy or drink more dairy.
I would love to see that someday. That would be amazing.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Padilla, before we start to wrap up here, can you maybe share a little bit about how people can work with you? Is mindset part of that? How do you do the health coaching part? And, where can people find you online if they want to follow you, learn more about what you're doing, and kind of learn the principles that you're really passionate about? Where can they do that?
Yeah. So they can find me on my website. It's leybelismd.com. So it's LEYBELISMD.com. And the same thing for on Instagram. And if someone was interested in coaching, they can certainly message me on my website or on DM me on Instagram, and we can kind of engage in that conversation from there. Or, I have my newsletter too that I love to send out weekly, and it's really just like short snippets of fun facts and health information. Like I just sent an email this past week on the most hydrating foods that we should be having this hot summer during the heat wave. And so that's great.
I think that you also have a free ebook on your website. I was just reviewing it before we got on. What is that about? I can't remember.
Yeah. So it's really, I don't remember the title now, gosh, but it was basically on how your gut can impact the skin, and your skin quality. And I have a few supplement recommendations of ways to kind of optimize your skin health and how your gut health can directly affect your skin. So.
Oh, I love that tie-in. I'll have to send you the link from my previous guest. He's actually focused specifically on the skin microbiome, and he had some interesting things to say about that. So you guys might have some good synergies so cool. there. So awesome. Again, yes, thanks. Dr. Padilla, thank you so much for sharing your time and your knowledge today. I will put all of her links, obviously, in the show notes, like always. But I really appreciate you coming on today as a guest.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.